Chances are you're familiar with the Disney Pixar animated film Up, or at least the image of elderly Carl's house, lifted away by balloons from the oppressive overdevelopment that had overwhelmed his neighborhood and his dreams. As the filmmakers were working on Carl's story, they discovered the real-life story of this little bungalow in the Ballard section of Seattle, a house, like Carl's, which was being surrounded by massive development. The movie's marketers decorated it in a 2009 publicity event for the film. The bungalow belonged to a woman named Edith Macefield. Edith first lived in the house when the area had other small bungalows. Like Carl, Edith was a person with big dreams, but for most of her life, this little house was home. By the time developers knocked on Edith's door in 2006, almost all of her neighbors had already gone. Edith refused to sell her home, so they built around her, a project that loomed over, darkened, and isolated the little house and the little old lady inside it. But Edith lived there resourcefully until her death in 2008. After the release of Up, Edith's house became a place of pilgrimage for many who left balloons in her honor. There are plans to lift and move the home to a scenic island to house a family in need there.
Hi, I'm Tess of Livable Ballard.
And I'm Bill, a community advocate and a former city council candidate.
And behind us is what's left of the Up House. The Up House in Ballard became a story across the world of one person's principled stand against development. It's also a metaphor for upzoning in Ballard and its negative effects: more and bigger construction, increasing housing prices, gentrification, homelessness, and a lower quality of life.
What's happened to Ballard is instructive, because Newton is facing now the kind of powerful upzoning and overdevelopment pressures Ballard confronted a decade ago. Will Newton be transformed as Ballard has been? Ballard and Newton are similar in many ways. Ballard was settled in 1853 and incorporated as a small town when the railroad arrived in 1889. The population then grew quickly, and Ballard reluctantly agreed in 1907 to be annexed into the city of Seattle to access Seattle's fresh water supply. For most of the next century, Ballard was an area with a diverse mix of residents, including workers in timber and wood products, shipping, fishermen, shopkeepers, and business people. Newton was settled in 1630, incorporated as a town in 1688, and grew rapidly after the railroad arrived in 1834. A town of farms, riverside mills, and grand summer houses for Boston's elite, Newton adopted a city form of government in 1873, in part to stave off annexation by Boston. Newton became an exemplar of the Garden City philosophy of self-contained development balanced between commercial, residential, and open space, while also being a streetcar suburb of Boston.
One difference between Ballard and Newton is that Washington State is a planned state with an emphasis on centralized state and regional planning and decision-making.
In contrast, Newton is a beneficiary of the Northeast's tradition of home rule and local land use decision-making. Another difference is their respective state population growth rates, keeping in mind that places that promote growth tend to get it. U.S. Census data show that from 2010 to 2015, Washington's population growth rate was 6.6%, well above the national average of 4.1%. Massachusetts grew more slowly than the national average at only 3.77%. Between 2013 and 2014, Seattle's population grew 2.3%, while Boston's grew less than 1%. There's more population and regulatory pressure on Ballard to force more intense housing land use than there is on Newton, but it's political and speculative pressures that really drive growth in both.
In 1990, the state of Washington enacted the Growth Management Act. It required local municipalities to incorporate growth targets as part of regional growth planning. 38 neighborhoods in Seattle, including Ballard, were designated as urban villages, appropriate for much more intense development. During this period, official neighborhood planning process engaged thousands of citizens to participate in deciding how to meet the growth targets they had been assigned. At first, infill housing units, while crowded, at least matched the scale of existing neighborhoods. In 2010, at the insistence of developers, the zoning codes were changed to allow far more intense development, and buildings no longer match what are in neighborhoods.
As the millennium came to a close, the tech boom in Seattle led to enormous pressure for real estate redevelopment. Elected officials and the developers and tech giants who fund their campaigns pushed for, quote, higher value, unquote, uses of land, or property speculation. Within the past decade, nearly 20 major condo retail projects were underway or had just been completed within a 5-block radius of downtown Ballard, adding some 2,500 new households to the neighborhood. In 2010, Seattle did a virtual upzone by allowing significantly more density in low-rise zones, ostensibly to provide greater affordability. Allowed building heights were raised, lot coverages increased, limits on the number of units on a parcel were removed, and requirements for providing parking on site were removed for many areas. As highly paid millennial tech workers, willing to pay higher rents for smaller units, poured into the area, families and less affluent renters were displaced. Single-family homeowners were and are besieged with offers and threats from developers seeking to buy and demolish their houses to build towers of high-priced studios and micro-units. Despite the non-stop construction of rental units, between 2010 and 2015, Seattle saw the fastest rise in rents of any place in the U.S. So much for added supply lowering prices. With so many added units, Ballard has reached 427% of the 20-year growth target it was set in 1994. In fact, Ballard has already exceeded its updated growth target through 2024.
Seattle no longer has a legitimate community engagement process. What they have now I call engagement theater. It's where residents are invited to participate in these superficial exercises, often involving Legos or Post-it notes. And this creates the appearance of community engagement and buy-in without really inviting substantial residential input on important issues.
The change has been dramatic. 50% of Seattle was zoned single-family, and 62% of Seattle's tree canopy was located in single-family zones. From 2001 to 2007, single-family lots undergoing redevelopment lost 41% of their tree canopy, while multi-unit lots lost 69%. Along with trees and green space, naturally affordable homes have been lost to higher-use redevelopment in the name of affordable housing. Rents on newer units are more than 50% higher than comparable older units. Many renters and small businesses have been displaced, and Seattle's homelessness problem has increased dramatically as housing prices have soared. The added housing has come with an insufficient increase in infrastructure, transit, or fire or police hires. With insufficient public safety staff, crime rates are on the rise. Politicians, tech leaders, and developers value the exchange value of land, its speculative value, not the value of the use to which it is currently put. Community coherence, security, historic preservation, green space, none of these matter.
As early as the 1970s, economists began documenting the process and effects of urban redevelopment and densification. Sociologist Harvey Molotch coined the term urban growth machine to describe the collective actions of the various parties that benefit from intense urban infill. The bankers, investors, developers, construction trades, and even city government looking to grow its tax base. Collectively, the growth machine has an insatiable appetite for growth at any cost. But this growth is unsustainable and benefits few while hurting many.
There's really no relief in sight for Ballard, where pro-growth media and city leadership are doing everything that they can to demonize single-family neighborhoods.
One even proposed a highest use tax that would charge residents not on the home they actually have, but on the highest possible use of their property. For those who continue to live in single-family houses in areas rezoned multifamily, to encourage turnover. Seattle's mayor recently introduced the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, or HALA, requiring still more mandatory upzoning in Ballard. This map resembles Newton's now infamous Lego map, the one where consultants told residents at a charrette they were required to put 300 Legos on a map of Newton to indicate where apartment buildings and townhomes should replace houses. Along with manipulative resident engagement events, the administration is embarking on a zoning reform process that many believe is focused on upzoning. Mayor Warren wants to build 3,200 new housing units, even though Newton has satisfied its 40B affordable housing requirement. Between lax zoning enforcement, inexpensive demolition permits, and special permits given out like nothing special, Newton's zoning ordinance is under siege, and so is our community. Teardowns are rampant, and so are replacement builds, McMansions, townhouses, multi-units, and apartment and condo complexes. All of them mean tremendous tree loss and displacement of people who cannot keep up with the higher housing prices brought by higher use redevelopment. Can we save Newton from Ballard's fate? What can we learn about the dangers of upzoning from the Seattle neighborhood that's home to the real-life Up House?
So Tess, my first question is going to be for you. You have lived in Ballard for almost 20 years. When you moved there, were you expecting your neighborhood to change the drastic way that it has?
No, when I first moved to Ballard, it was very much a quiet maritime community with a lot of fishermen, and rents were very affordable. And though there was some urban infill that was starting at that time, it was so moderate in scale that it kind of went unnoticed. So it wasn't until the changes of 2010 that I really began to notice an acceleration of development, and the changes that occurred were very rapid at that point.
Bill, I want to ask you about Seattle generally, as you don't live in Ballard, but you live in the central district of the city. Are the dramatic changes in Ballard happening all over? So are they happening in your area of Seattle as well?
Yeah, Seattle in general is growing at a very rapid clip. It's been about a 10% population growth increase in about the last 5 years. It's been very, very rapid. A lot of this has to do with the rapid expansion of our tech sector. Amazon, Expedia, and other companies at Google are expanding very quickly in the city. And that has put a very intense demand on housing for us.
I'd also like to frame this discussion. We saw a little bit in the introductory video, but to reiterate a little bit of the differences between our two communities, between Newton and Ballard. So Washington is one of the fastest growing states, and Seattle one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And that is partly because of policy choices that promote high density. Massachusetts, by contrast, and greater Boston are growing much more slowly. Nevertheless, Newton is independent of Boston, so even though what happens in Boston affects us a great deal, our elected leaders do have the power to take measures to protect us from the spillover effects. We have a tradition of home rule, that is less state and regional control over things like weather and how we grow, whereas Ballard, part of Seattle, has more centralized and regionalized control over local density, even setting growth target levels that Ballard is legally required to meet. It seems like Washington state leaders decided some time ago to promote growth at all costs. Setting growth targets is one way to do that, as we've seen. So conversely, here in Newton, and I think it's true for the suburbs in many eastern Massachusetts towns, people expect stability in zoning and their community. And we react oftentimes negatively to sudden high-density intrusions into the neighborhood in which we've invested our lives and our life savings. So my question is, did people in Ballard have similar expectations of stability? And if so, what specifically happened? Do Seattle, Ballard residents in particular accept the high-density transformation? Do they work to counter it or feel powerless to change it? And I think that's for either one of you, if you'd care to address that.
So I think you make an important distinction because Seattle is a larger metropolitan area, and I think most people who live in Seattle expect some manner of change to come with urban living. So it's really the rate of change that people are objecting to. I think we were all braced for a little bit of growth, but it's really the what I call underregulated hyper development that's so appalling to most people. There's lots of very sudden changes, like the Ballard is now at 429% of its targeted growth, which we're not obliged to meet those targets. They're used as kind of planning guidelines. But we're at 429% of the targeted growth for 2024 already. So those growth targets are meant to kind of make sure that we don't have growth that races ahead of our infrastructure and service expansion. And we don't have a mechanism to really stop the growth if we go too far. And so I think what people are objecting to is all of the impacts that come with the growth and not having the infrastructure and services to support our quality of life as we're growing. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, I think part of the narrative that's created is that people are afraid of change and they're unwilling to accept change. I think the larger issue is it's not so much that people are unwilling to accept change, they just want to be made aware of what the changes are and be a part of the conversation. And so what happens is that the city had set targets working with the neighborhoods. Tess alluded to the 400% growth that they've achieved over their targets. Well, those targets are set based on providing infrastructure, bus capacity, schools, that sort of thing. And what's happening to the neighborhoods is because we have excessive growth in certain areas, children have to go to school in portables. We don't have, physical classrooms for them. Buses are overflowing, and a bus line that should be running on an every 10-minute cycle, every bus that shows up is full. They just can't handle the population growth. So that's what people find frustrating. And so the problem is, as Tess alluded to, is we don't have any ability to tell the city to stop that growth. Now, the city could potentially put tools in place, higher taxing, limiting the amount of growth that's happening by raising development fees and that sort of thing. And they don't do that. And that's one of the challenges that we have, is trying to get the public aware of what kind of possibilities are available to them, and then to get city government to enact those.
But you're right. We're kind of blindsided by the growth that took place in Ballard starting in 2010, because it was so kind of sleepy up until that point, and then it just accelerated so quickly. And so people are only becoming aware of it now, as it feels like it's in some ways too late.
And part of that was because in 2010, they loosened some of the development guidelines related to the zoning, the low-rise zoning in Ballard. And this is when we began seeing the out-of-scale development, where building heights were to be limited to 30 feet, for example, in certain zones, and through changes in what they call the language of the zoning code, they went up to 40 feet. And then developers were able to stack height bonuses through loopholes in the code. And so in zones that were formerly 30 feet high, we're now seeing buildings approaching 60 feet. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for people. It's a shock. And,
especially if you live in a tiny, little bungalow that was built in the 1900s, to have a big towering behemoth beside you is pretty.
Yes, and my understanding is that the setbacks have also diminished, and adding to
Right.
the sense of added density.
Yeah, and there's secondary effects of that as well. Loss of tree coverage. When the setbacks are so narrow, you can't plant a tree. And for us in Seattle, green Seattle, that's a big issue.
So I have a sort of follow-up question to that. So can either of you or both of you tell us what you think about whether high-density growth in parts of Seattle was necessary for the city to thrive economically, or if some of that growth might have been guided to other cities in Washington State, or alternatively, could Seattle's growth have been managed in a different or even better way?
Right. In your setup piece, you talked about how we have a regional planning model. And about 15 years or so ago, we had a regional plan that talked about growth in the Puget Sound region being a leveled growth throughout the region. And there was a consortium of interests, largely downtown property owners, some of the development community, and so on, that were interested in perhaps changing that model a little bit, and had a big influence with our Regional Growth Council, and targeted most of the growth into then Bellevue and Seattle. And this is when we began seeing this explosive growth in the late, 2008, 2009, 2010.
The city has been reluctant to enact impact fees, which we've been urging them to do, which would put some of the burden of building some of the burden of paying for the cost of infrastructure and impacts on the developers themselves rather than on the communities.
So a little bit to go back to the question, do you think that some of the growth might have been guided to other parts of Washington State, or do you feel like Seattle?
So it's been great for tech. This growth has been great for tech, but that's a single sector. And in order for neighborhoods to be healthy, they need to have people working in all kinds of industries and services. And while the city has done what it can to really pave the way for a healthy tech economy, it's pushed out everybody else in the process of doing so. So a lot of our blue-collar workers can't afford to live in the city anymore.
Oh, Tess, that is actually a perfect segue to my next question, which is, can you both tell us a bit about displacement and gentrification in Ballard?
Well, Ballard used to be a community that had a bunch of old homes that were subdivided into vintage rentals. Oftentimes, a home, from 1900 would be turned into 4 different apartments, and because they were vintage rentals, they tended to be much less expensive than new luxury apartments. So as we've added units in Seattle, we've raised all of these old homes, and we've lost all of our affordable housing. I mean, we've gained probably some affordable housing. I should say we've lost a lot of our low-income housing. And so we've added more units in Ballard than in a lot of parts of the city. And despite the developer narrative that by adding more units by virtue of supply and demand is what they always refer to, we should see a decrease in the price of rentals. It's actually gone up higher in the neighborhoods that have seen the most development. And that's because of the shrinking inventory of vintage housing, which tends to be a lot more affordable than new housing.
Bill, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, a couple things. One is, our growth in our tech sector, what we're doing is we're basically importing the workers. We're not creating a job market that caters to the people who live there. So what's happening is, because we're importing these tech jobs, and these jobs are much higher paid jobs, it's creating a market for higher priced housing. The developers like that, of course. So what Tess alluded to is we're knocking down affordable homes and putting in higher density homes. Townhouses that are being built are very expensive, anywhere between $600,000 to $1 million in some neighborhoods. And so the housing stock we're creating is not affordable. The market generally does not do that. And I think most housing economists will tell you that in order to build affordable housing, it has to be pretty heavily subsidized by government. And we're not doing that very well. The mayor's proposal for HALA that you talked about in the setup piece has some mechanisms to build affordable housing, but it really doesn't address the real needs that we have. Seattle in particular is seeing a very strange, what I like to call it a dumbbell kind of effect of job growth. About 95% of the jobs in the region that have been created in the last many years have either been below $35,000. So this is basically the service workers and low wage workers, and then above 125,000. That's 95% of the jobs are in both ends of that spectrum. So we're carving out the middle class, and we're carving out the housing stock that supports that middle class. And again, it's creating a very devastating effect on many people in Seattle because of that.
Yep, thank you. Does that parallel with business displacement because of gentrification?
Well, when one of the problems we see is that for small businesses, older workplaces are the affordable spaces, and when new construction comes in, the commercial lease rates for those are 50% or so higher. So that makes it very difficult for a business that has been moved out of an area that's being redeveloped to be able to come back into that area because the costs are so much higher. Now, in Washington State, we have the ability to subsidize housing. But there's no, under state constitution, we're not allowed to subsidize small businesses. So we're seeing a lot of neighborhoods that have been filled with locally owned businesses and small businesses and so on are being replaced with national chains and big box stores and that sort of thing, and not a healthy economy for many of us.
Yep, thank you so much. This is maybe a little bit redundant, but let me see if it teases anything else out. So here in Newton, developers and politicians often tell us that we need to be welcoming and build more affordable housing for people who can't afford to live here. But 75 to 85% of the new housing that is built is more expensive than comparable housing that's already here. New construction is driving up land values, house prices, and rents. And so a naturally attainable house is demolished, and in Newton it happens every 3 to 4 days we're losing an attainable, affordable house. So the new housing is being replaced by a lot of high-density units, not exclusively, but to some degree, and is actually making Newton less affordable for the vast majority of people who live here or might want to live here. And the new people moving in tend to be wealthier than the people who they're replacing. So we're being told we have to accept high density to increase housing affordability, and at the same time, this new construction is really making housing less affordable. So my question is, what you've alluded to, what's the experience been in Ballard, and what are developers and politicians telling people in Ballard and Seattle about affordable housing?
Well, as we've said several times here, building more doesn't make stuff cheaper, and the evidence is, and has not been contrary anywhere, is that when you build denser, it does not make housing less expensive. As you know, land costs really are a big part of development, but then there's also the cost per square foot. So if you have cheap land and you build a single-story house, that's probably your cheapest form of housing you can produce. Once you start putting in more intense land use, more intense housing on that, the land value is going to go up. So people are going to have to pay more to be able to build that. And then when you build the higher density housing, there are far more costs associated with that because you have to build stronger foundations, you have to bring in cranes to lift the materials up to higher levels, and so on. So the net effect on a per square foot basis is a higher cost.
I think what you might have been alluding to in your question is that there is a real dominant narrative put out there by developers that building more will just innately bring the cost down. And we hear all the time on social media and in blogs about development and density, it's just Econ 101. Build more and the cost will come down. But what they don't tell you is that in Econ 102, they tell you that there are exceptions to the rules of supply and demand, and housing happens to be one of them. So but it is shocking how dominant this narrative is, that if you build more, the price will come down no matter what. And that just has not borne out at all in what we've seen in Seattle. The neighborhoods with the most density have had the highest rate of increases.
Yep, thank you. To get to the surrounding area, so here in Newton we have strange bedfellows, developers and environmentalists. So we're losing more than 600 street trees a year, probably a couple of thousand on private property each year, as houses are demolished and the lots are clear-cut for development. So oversized McMansions and high-density housing projects replace more structured and paved surfaces on every lot. And we're losing lawns, backyards, and neighborhood greenery with each new building. So, complicated question, but why is concrete the new green? Can you talk about the alliance between green organizations and big developers in Ballard and Seattle? And what is greenwashing?
Well, so I can say what the greenwashing is, and then maybe Bill can speak to the issue of what kind of alliances are present in Seattle between greenwashers and developers. But so I always think of greenwashing as just the rebranding of free market deregulation as green. And so that's what we call greenwashing, is when an entity like a developer starts clear cutting lots and building things that have no permeable rainwater filtration system that would help clean our water as it passes through grass and dirt. You're right, it's all concrete. And despite doing this, they are promoting the idea that they're sparing outlying areas sprawl by pouring everybody into these neighborhoods. But it's absolutely untrue, because as they pour density into these neighborhoods, they kind of break them for all but a select group of people. So by making Ballard, for example, kind of a magnet for young tech workers, they've eliminated most of their housing stock for 2-bedroom apartments for people who are not within that income range. And so those people have to go out of the city in order to find an affordable place to live. So then they're coming back into the city to work every day. So it's actually, their carbon footprint is actually greater.
And it sounds like the opposite of the intent that was promoted.
I understand the intent. The intent kind of makes sense theoretically, but you have to make sure that as you're creating more density, you're preserving affordable housing so that those people can stay in the city instead of having to leave the city and come back in. And that's just not part of what, that's not economically advantageous to the developers. And so they just develop like the highest rate housing that they can, because of course they're trying to maximize their profits. But despite the fact that they're pushing people out of the city and those people are driving back into the city, enlarging the general carbon footprint of Seattle, it's still marketed as like a moral position to take, like pro-density no matter what, even if it's without preservation of affordable housing, without robust tree protections, without community input. It's still marketed as this kind of progressive attitude, and it's just very successful branding is all it is.
And what is public transportation? Does that support the density that's coming to Ballard?
No, not currently. I mean, we have had some infrastructure expansion, but nowhere near what we need for the numbers that we have. And we just heard that the light rail system, which we've all been begging for now for many decades, will start being built in 20 years. So we're at 400 and almost 430% of our targeted population for 2024, and they're not going to build light rail for 20 years.
Wow. Bill, do you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, kind of go back to the idea of the greenwashing and so on. A number of years ago, Seattle was challenged by a pundit to address climate change through a carbon neutrality strategy. And I think, there's very few people, I think, who would disagree that there is, anthropomorphic effects of our behaviors on the atmosphere, that we need to move pretty quickly away from fossil fuels and so on. So Seattle put together what they called a bold plan to make the city carbon neutral by 2050. Now, if anyone's been following the climate debate, we're in crisis and we need to be climate neutral pretty darn quick. But this climate action plan really was used as a basis to argue for greater land use development and greater intensification of the city, without really looking at perhaps maybe what we could be doing to make ourselves truly carbon neutral and to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So this is part of this greenwashing effect and this packaging that somehow, by changing the way the city grows and by removing existing homes and putting in newer, expensive homes, somehow that has a positive effect on the environment. It's all kind of wrapped up in this greenwashing of climate change. We also see organizations like the Sierra Club that have been, in effect, been co-opted by a pro-growth membership. And it really doesn't take much to kind of take over an organization. You get 3 or 4 or 5 people showing up to regular meetings. They get themselves elected to the local executive board. And next thing you know, the Sierra Club, which is supposed to be interested in, trees and the natural environment, natural systems, and so on, is out there advocating for greater intensity of land use. San Francisco just had a big battle within its Sierra Club, where the true progressive green parts of the Sierra Club were able to beat off a pro-development wing within there. So that kind of behavior is pretty typical. We see other organizations as well. Social justice organizations now are pushing pro-density. We have, our Cascade Bicycle Club has become a pro-density organization. So these behaviors, and I see people in the back laughing because this is very typical. Academics have documented this as a kind of a formulaic thing happening throughout the U.S. Many cities that are facing this pro-growth agenda have these same kind of behaviors, that it's environmentally sound, it's for social justice reasons. If you don't accept this, you're a racist. That kind of narrative. The NIMBY name comes up, which is immediately used to shut down any kind of dialogue, any kind of issues. If we're reducing our quality of life, if we're making our communities less livable, why are we doing this? So we just need to make sure that when we have this dialogue, that both sides of the conversation are heard. And right now, it's really kind of a one-sided thing with the developers kind of leading the charge.
One final thing about this density implementation that we're seeing in Ballard being green, it's really hard to see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes being bulldozed into splinters and thrown away, and talk about how is that green? We have a recycling imperative here in the city where every person who lives here has to recycle every jar of peanut butter, every plastic bag. That's something that as a resident of the city, I believe in doing. I'm a very avid recycler. I throw away almost nothing. It's either composted or recycled. But then the developer across the street from me can take a 100-year-old home in which the beams of the home are almost as dense as a hardwood because they're from old growth fir. And they take all of that material and they throw it away. They're not even recycling these homes. They're throwing away whole houses. So it's very hard to see how this is green. It's just so profoundly wasteful.
Yeah, that's actually a point that other people in Newton have brought up about all the teardowns and, what the environmental effect of teardowns is. Yeah, Bill, you look like you wanted to add something.
I was just going to say the greenest building is a building that's already there, right? To take down a structure and to replace it with another one, even if it's higher insulation values and so on. And that's one of the problems that we have is that the preservationist movement is nascent in our city. We're starting to realize that we need to be more, begin looking at the historical value of these communities and tying that more to the environmental value of those communities. Same thing with trees. We take down the trees, and the city will say, "Oh, we're taking down a 24-inch, Doug fir, but we're going to put in 3 new saplings. And somehow
3 arborvitaes that will die because they're not watered.
and so the economics of it is not really, it's not really thought through. And so it's incumbent upon us as citizen activists to educate the government, to educate our elected officials as to what are the true economics of this, and and to counteract this greenwashing narrative or the social justice narrative.
Yeah. Well, that actually leads, Bill, I have a specific question for you, and then for you, Tess. So, Bill, you ran for Seattle City Council this past fall. I ran for Newton City Council. Unfortunately, we were both unsuccessful. But everywhere I go in Newton, people are complaining about the ubiquitous teardowns, the lack of zoning enforcement, about high-density projects that would destroy the character and scale of our village centers, about traffic and poor condition of infrastructure. They're worried about taxes, alarmed that their adult children won't be able to afford to live here, and increasingly notice that the socioeconomic and ethnic diversity that we are really proud of is being threatened by displacement and gentrification. I ran on a platform to address all those concerns and lost to a person who is very pro high-density development, but the turnout was low. And in some regard, the people who run the city, who have access to getting out the vote, get their hardcore supporters out, and so I lost. But my question is, why do you think it is that people don't vote, or do you think people don't vote in Seattle when they're upset about what's happening? And is that something that happens in Seattle?
Well, we have, it's a nationwide problem, that we have issues with turnout. Seattle, we had about a 41%, I think, turnout for our local city council elections.
Yeah, that's pretty high.
And I think, I think there's a frustration level that people have. They feel that their vote doesn't count, that their voice is not heard. This is I guess you could do a whole nother town meeting on this particular topic of why people aren't voting. But, I've generally had a very positive response to my campaign when I would meet with people directly. My opponent was part of the political machine. There's an issue of identity politics that made my race very complicated. I was outfunded by about 3 or 4 to 1 in terms of monies. And of course, all the political machine endorsements went to my opponent. So I had a very difficult race. I actually got into the race with a different opponent, and that was a sitting council member who had basically been responsible for a lot of the land use and zoning changes that people were so offended by, and felt that we had a very good chance of winning. But she dropped out about 2 weeks after I got into the race. She dropped out, and this young woman, civil rights attorney, was put in her place, and she carried the narrative forward, but wouldn't talk about issues. It was more about how she'd pulled herself up by her bootstraps. The dialogue was pretty much about, it's time for minorities on council and that sort of thing. So in a way, I feel I was kind of undermined by the political machine. I think, the narrative that we are talking about today, I think is understood. I think people are just purely frustrated by it. And, my race was complicated by being able to reach, a population of 600,000 people with very little funding.
Yeah, just to give you a little context, Bill, our turnout for this past local election was, I think, 18%, and we were thrilled that it was so high.
Well, yeah, and this is the problem we have with our democracy, is there are very few people that are engaged. And I would encourage all the people sitting in the room, you can't just go to a meeting. You have to help people who are working, like Chris and Lynn, who are trying to, pull together. Everyone has to work hard at this, and you have to. And as an activist, as an organizer, you are met with many failures to every victory that you have, and you have to kind of stick with it. And it's very frustrating to, go to city council and have them tell you no, and then you go back again later and they tell you no, and you see the developers winning all the time. You can't give up. You have to keep fighting. And that's the only advice I have. And in voting is just a small fraction of that. We're kind of led to believe that, well, if we vote, things will change. And that's really not it. You have to be vigilant, at every council meeting. You got to read what they're up to. You got to try and figure out who's talking to who. You You got to get your community groups out there and lobby on a regular basis. So voting is a very small fraction of this. It's really a greater commitment to, to being a part of how government functions for you.
Yep.
6 of the 9 city council members that ran in our last election had the same campaign managing entity, and they kind of worked as a well-orchestrated team. They used the same kind of key points. Every time one would speak in public, they would kind of mirror and echo the talking points of all the other city council people. So it was really a battle to capture any amount of the narrative. And then I would say that a lot of the loss for our neighborhood in Ballard was just ignorance, really. I mean, I have friends who are as opposed to the underregulated development that we're having here as I am, and yet they voted for the person who was responsible for most of it. So a lot of the people who shared similar concerns around underregulated growth voted for the candidate who was the pro-growth candidate just because his marketing campaign was so successful. He's someone who bikes everywhere, and he made a big show of protesting Shell when they were in the Puget Sound, and so he's very he makes sure that his progressive badges are front and center. Mm-hmm. And so he successfully marketed himself, particularly to young people, as a progressive candidate, despite the fact that he's really a very neoliberal candidate. And so part of the issue is just how do you expose the discrepancy between how someone markets themselves and what they're actually doing in city council meetings. And you can't really even see those discrepancies unless you attend the city council meetings and kind of focus on what they're doing. So, and most voters don't have the time to do that. So yeah. It is really an uphill battle.
My next question to you, Tess, sort of dovetails on that. So here in Newton, and this is about how candidates are seen or how residents are seen. So here in Newton, we've seen letters in the local paper implying, as you noted in Seattle, people who oppose high-density housing developments are racist or elitist or care only about trees and not anything else, not the planet. So we've also seen some vicious personal attacks on community preservation and open space advocates on a local blog. So what about in Seattle? I understand that just as high density growth is out of control, so is public shaming and harassment of those who, dare to want to live in Seattle, a single family bungalow. So what I'm asking you about is the public discourse.
Anybody who asks for any change to the growth agenda here in Seattle and the growth implementation as it's being promoted by our city leadership are very quickly demonized, and the conversation is very toxic. It's very challenging to even want to discuss some of these things publicly because we have so many opponents who have easy access to journalists who have their own blogs, who will retweet things that people say on Nextdoor. They'll take images of conversations around growth issues that people have had in online communities like Nextdoor or Facebook, and they'll take screenshots of that and then tweet them to their communities of pro-growth people and use people's personal names. And it is a very toxic environment, and it has a chilling effect. I think a lot of people don't even want to get involved in the conversation because they're so worried that they're going to be cast as some sort of elitist. And so it has been a struggle for sure to try to participate in that narrative without having the toxicity of it affect us.
So I think I'm going to need to sort of wrap it up here, but I had a final question, and that has to do with what you think the role of residents and small business owners is in planning for the present and future. So you're with Livable Ballard. We have the Newton Villages Alliances here, and we have other community work groups. But I think the question would be, we alluded to this in the video. We have a lot of consultant-led community engagement events and studies that seem to have outcomes that support policies that developers and politicians would like to see in place. So the question is, should we leave decisions about our community to developers, politicians, planners, and consultants? Or should we, the people who live and work and pay taxes here, take the lead in determining what our community is like? Is that a good question for the end?
A couple of decades ago, Seattle, when it was first came under the Growth Management Act, the State Growth Management Act, they went through a process of engaging thousands and thousands of citizens in a grassroots neighborhood-based planning effort. The city provided money to each neighborhood for a consultant to come in and help shape their growth plan. Growth targets were allocated to certain areas, urban villages, and those growth targets were then supported with capital spending plans. Literally, for my neighborhood, it was a document this thick of a spreadsheet that talked about all the improvements, everything from schools and lights and crosswalks and tree planting and so on, to support the growth that was coming into the community, new libraries and so on. What's happened over the last couple of decades is that model has shifted from one that's a grassroots bottom-up model to one that is top-down. Yeah. And there's a gentleman here in Seattle who had ran our Department of Neighborhoods, who helped implement that stuff, a guy by the name of Jim Deers. He has a really excellent book called Neighborhood Power, which talks about how neighborhoods can define their growth. And he travels around the world teaching the Seattle way of how you do grassroots neighborhood planning for growth and development. The problem is in Seattle, we don't do that anymore. We've now been co-opted by this. This is how it's going to be. This is good. It's green, it's social justice and so on, and the two-way communication has been broken, and the grassroots voice has been lost. The city is very good at creating commissions and so on, where they say it's a public commission, but they hand select who's a part of it and so on. Yeah. It's very insidious stuff and kind of a scary 1984 east is west kind of model that we live in right now.
Yeah, Tess, you look like you want to add to that.
Oh, I was just going to say, a lot of our planning meetings where communities are invited to participate and engage. I always joke that it feels like we're being asked to choose our form of execution because it's, they'll give you 3 solutions and none of them are things that you want. And they'll ask you, which of these horrible solutions do you want for your neighborhood? Like, well, where do you write no? I don't want any of this.
Yep.
Here's another example. There's a community down in the southeast of Seattle, a largely minority community that for years had, as a group, worked together to put together a growth plan for the community. And it's a very interesting plan. It does talk about accepting population growth. It targets the type of business that they want to have. They've decided that they want to have a food-based economy and a food-based culture. They want to have teaching institutions. They want to be able to grow food. They want to be able to process food and market it and sell it and so on. They kind of define their destiny. The city is not willing to listen to them and does not want to engage them. And it's very frustrating considering a couple of decades ago, that was kind of exactly the kind of thing that Seattle wanted to have happen.
Yeah, we are experiencing similar kind of disjointedness.
I wanted to just talk a little bit about the word density, because we've been throwing that around quite a bit. And density is a term that demographers use to talk about the number of people per square mile. Well, from an urban planning standpoint, that's an important thing to know. If you have lots of people, you'll need maybe more schools, you'll need more medical services, hospitals, libraries, that sort of thing. We talk about housing density, and that helps us understand what kind of housing forms we're going to have. They talk about number of units per acre. Together, it's the housing forms and the number of people that you want to have live in an area that help you figure out what's the best way to do this. And we've kind of walked away from using those ideas to just say we need density. And what does that mean? Does that mean lots of people in one room? Because you can have a very dense area that is literally just one giant tower surrounded by green grass for, over the course of an acre or so. or you could have it spread out in little cottages. And both of those, address the issue of density in different ways by using different building forms.
So I am going to say right now, thank you so much for answering all of these questions. Can we have a round of applause?
I was shocked to find out that Massachusetts has more than 250,000 vacant housing units. All we ever hear about is the housing shortage. But we have these vacant units that are foreclosures, they're apartment buildings that aren't being kept up, they're public housing projects that haven't been maintained. Do you have a lot of vacant housing units in Ballard and Seattle?
We have a slightly different problem, and then just to reinforce what you're saying, I've seen things that say that every homeless person in the United States could move into an existing housing unit that's there already. It's just the problem is the housing's not in the right place. We don't have a lot of vacancies or empty housing units, but we do have.
We have more in Ballard than we have in other parts of the city. Yeah. Ballard has a higher vacancy rate than a lot of areas of the city, despite being a very in-demand neighborhood to live in now. It's a very popular and expensive neighborhood, but it's also, there are higher vacancy rates here. And I think, I don't know how this works exactly, but I suspect that it has something to do with building these big apartment complexes where it's more conducive to the owners to maximize their profits on a place if they hold an apartment vacant for a little while at one high level of renting rather than rent it out at a lower rate and be locked in for a certain number of months at that lower rate. So I think that's what's happening. But we do have slightly higher rates in neighborhoods that have more development, which is weird.
Yeah, I think what you're alluding to is there's empty homes that are unoccupied, and we really don't have that. We're seeing a couple different things. One is we have between 2,000 and 3,000 units of housing that appear to be held up for VRBO and Airbnb and those types of vacation rental. So we've lost some units to that. Tessa's alluding to the higher vacancy rate in Ballard. That's largely because those numbers come out of the rental market, rental housing association, and they're looking at units of 20-unit buildings and larger. And we have a lot of that new housing in Ballard. The housing costs there are $2,000 to $3,000 a month. So that's why there's so many of those units that sit empty. What we don't have is a lot of smaller homes, starter homes, lower cost housing. That stuff is really where we have a mismatch between the demand side and the supply side.
Yeah, I think that's where we see Newton headed, towards a growing mismatch between what's needed and what's being built. Another question is, in the greater Boston area, and like in New York and some other major cities, and we're even seeing it in Newton in large houses, we're seeing an influx of cash from foreign investors who are making safe haven investments in real estate. So you'll have luxury condo units in Boston that are just vacant. We have huge houses in Newton that are vacant, owned by overseas investors. And that's contributing both to pushing up housing prices, but also the so-called housing shortage. Do you have that phenomenon in Seattle?
Yeah, absolutely, big time. Bellevue is seeing a lot more of single-family home purchases with investment capital. But in Seattle, we're seeing a lot of building, big high-rise development that's going in that is targeted either to wealthy investors or just parking money. And, that's just a natural phenomenon in the economic cycle when the, business markets, the stock markets and so on aren't yielding well, cash will flow from there into real estate because it's a more stable investment. And we're seeing that big time in China, China money coming out of the Chinese stock market, coming into Seattle and building. So it is a problem. It distorts greatly, what's being built here and how it's used. And we have high vacancies. I've heard that in a typical multi-unit building where we're talking about 20 or more units, their economic models, when the developers put these together, they don't need very high vacancy. They can basically break even if they rent only half the building. But what they won't do is they won't rent the units at lower rates. So they'll leave the building, they'll leave the unit empty, because if they tried to rent it out at, instead of $3,000 a month, say for $1,000 a month to get someone in there, the people who are paying $3,000 a month are going to say, hey, wait a second, why are they paying only $1,000? I'm paying $3,000. So they want to keep the rents high. The other phenomenon is once rents and cost of housing gets up, it really doesn't go down unless you have a pretty significant economic collapse. So, when our housing prices have gone up, we're not going to see a dramatic drop down. Houses, it used to be able, back in the 80s and 90s, you could buy a house in Seattle for $50,000. And that actually drove a lot of economic development, economic growth in the area, because that was a big attractive point. Bring your business here, you can get a house for $50,000. Now you got to bring your business there and you got to pay $600,000 or $700,000 for a house. That's a very bad thing for economic growth.
My last question is, I want to start out with an observation. I think it is very, very interesting that you, Bill, were one of the people leading the charge to create district-based city councilors, what would be equivalent to our ward city councilors here. At the same time that you successfully did that, here in Newton, we are undergoing a process called charter reform. And our understanding is that some of the people leading the charter reform are very keen to eliminate our ward city councilors.
Right.
My personal opinion is that ward city councilors are more responsive to residents, and at large or citywide city councilors are less responsive and tend to be more responsive to developers. So I think it's interesting that you moved in a direction towards more grassroots democracy at the same time that we seem to be moving in a direction away from grassroots democracy. But that's not the question. The question is, can you talk a little bit about the role of campaign finance, the ties between developers and politicians, and what that has to do with upzoning, overdevelopment, all the things we've been talking about? Can you talk about the political angle? And then I'm going to sit down. Thanks.
Well, I'll use the reason why we did the district elections was because to run citywide in Seattle, it was campaigns were averaging $250,000 to $300,000 to do that, and that is not any way that a grassroots person can run a campaign. I in my campaign was able to raise about $85,000. Beating many people's expectations, but my opponent raised well over $350,000. A lot of that money comes from the downtown and the development interests and so on. So myself and a few other activists a number of years ago, trying to fight the city on these issues, banging our head against the wall each time, said we need to change the way our council members are elected, and so that's why we did our charter amendment to change from a citywide election to a local one. But we saw during this last election cycle a lot of independent expenditure money coming from the downtown chamber into the races. The council member that Tess was talking about in her district was very heavily financed by independent expenditures, and through developers and that sort of thing. And the development, it's a network of institutions and sources and people. So it's money makes a big difference, and communication makes a big difference. There's the mechanisms for people to get together and hear what's going on. Newspapers, tend to have a bend, that maybe is spoken one way or another. That's why you want to go to your local news source, and stay away from the corporate media, as they say.
I'd love to see massive campaign finance reform and publicly funded elections in Seattle in order to get rid of some of the influence peddling that I see happening. Yeah. I really think it's at the core of all of our problems.
We just passed a campaign finance legislation here in Seattle. It's the second attempt that we've had to do that. And it's arguably a progressive mechanism. And what we called it democracy dollars. And basically, each citizen gets $100 in vouchers that they are allowed to allocate to certain candidates at a $10 increment or $100. It's paid through a property tax levy. Now, here's the downside of it, because right now that gives a voice to people who typically don't have a voice. The problem is the amount of money that's going to be allocated, it's like on a first come, first served basis. So the concern that I have is these groups that have been co-opted, that have big networks like the Sierra Club and some of the labor unions and so on that have potentially a pro-growth agenda, will go out very early on to their constituents and say, spend your democracy dollars on these 5 people. And then when those dollars are spent up, that shuts off the supply for other people. So even though we have some campaign finance reform and we have the potential for it, there's also a potential for, exploitation of the system.
I'm Julia Maliki. I'm also a candidate who didn't make it last time, and I live in a bungalow. I love bungalows, and I'm very involved in trees, so everything you say really speaks to me. I guess my question is, the zoning changes and what's happening in your neighborhood in Ballard, is it, at this point, do you think irreversible? Is it just going to continue on until everything is as dense as what we saw in the dense part of the contrast pictures? And after that, I mean, if that space is fully developed, are they going to then target more areas of Seattle?
So yeah, I am concerned that that there is really no end in sight, especially for the urban villages. So the part of Ballard where I live now is what the city calls a dynamic growth zone. It means they've targeted that area for high growth. And we've talked to city council members about how the new additions of townhomes and apartment buildings that are 3 to 4 stories tall don't match the scale of what's already there. And they basically told us, well, we don't care because this is the area that we're targeting for change. And so, like Bill has said, the greenest type of infill is using what's already there. They have explicitly stated that not only are they okay with us throwing away the houses that are in these high density growth zones, but they expect that somewhere down the line, they'll also throw away all the new homes that they're building, and then they'll build even taller. So they're really not planning for the long term. And so I think, I don't think there's really a stopping point for my little neighborhood. And then I would imagine that they will eventually want to start adding to these suburban villages and increasing kind of their general percentage of the city. And we're already seeing some changes that will affect single family zoning too. Very rarely do you see the things that you want being made or built just by freeing up the market. I don't know of a single situation where you deregulate something and then it magically creates just what you want. It seems like the absolute opposite is true. If you want to build the city of your dreams, you actually need to do some real city planning. And our city planning has basically been a plan of no plan, just deregulating everything and kind of throwing it to the developers. So,
my name is Elaine Rush Aruda, and this question is for Tess. As one of the founders of Livable Ballard, I would love to hear if you've had any small victories along the way and what you're able to do to be successful.
Kind of farther down the path than you are, so you have a lot of opportunities to get your kids involved. The real trouble that we've had is that so Ballard's urban village is what's been targeted the most, and we just saw that people kind of got they got pressured into selling their homes when they'd start to see their blocks go. And so as they sold their homes, and one of these 40-foot monoliths would go in on the block, everybody else would get nervous about putting new improvements into their home or adding on that addition that they wanted to, or everybody started kind of doing that calculus of, is this going to pay off? Is the next person that buys my house just going to tear it down anyway? And so you'd see this like very slow blighting of the neighborhood as people chose not to invest in their properties. And then as the developers would offer them more and more, we get probably 4 or 5 offers a week on our house, shoved through the mail slip, but we know it's to someone who wants to tear it down. So as this happens, people have stopped investing in their neighborhoods, and now the demographic has shifted enough that we are pretty soon going to be a neighborhood of mostly new people. So you just have to make sure that your efforts kind of take place before that shift comes, because the tipping point already kind of happened for us. We have probably more new people living in Ballard now than we do old residents. So the people that are kind of hanging on to wanting to preserve some of the architecture are few and far between. And, you know, it takes a while to get up to speed on some of these issues. And so the new people just aren't really aware of it yet. And it's going to probably be a number of years where they have to live here before they develop an awareness of kind of what's going on around them. So I'm sorry to say we have not had a lot. I would say the one positive thing is that connected with a lot of other people that are very passionate about these issues, and I've become more knowledgeable about civics than I ever previously was, and mostly only interested in national elections until, like 4 years ago when I started kind of waking up to what was happening in local elections. But yeah, it's been a tough road.
Well, thank you for, you can consider your participation today for us as a big success. And
I hope that's the case. And I hope that you guys have kind of popped in early enough.
Great, well,
I hope you guys have kind of intervened early enough that you actually have an opportunity to enact some of the changes that you want, or to at least run a little bit of interference.
We have had some I think, pretty big successes. We were able to, there was our 1.5 land use to get us out from under a state law that allows overdevelopment and waiving of a lot of zoning. So we've been able to accomplish that. A neighborhood group has been able to have a developer withdraw a proposal for 185 unit building. We've been able to shrink down some of the proposed buildings. So we've definitely seen a lot of successes along the way, and I think what we're hoping to do is use your knowledge and experience to help us rise people up to make the commitment to try and speak up and help us be more in control of what happens to the future of Newton.
Yeah.
Organize. You gotta reach out to your neighbors, knock on doors, have community meetings. Yeah.
So Bill and Tess, thank you again. And also I'd like to say thank you to everyone who came today. It was incredibly informative. And honestly, I can imagine that people are much more aware of the issues now, and perhaps we can come to part 2 at some point. So thank you so much.
Let's keep the dialogue going.